Did Meghan Markle really slap Prince Harry in front of stunned palace staff while shouting, "You're just a spare? You're just a spare"? The words, sharp as a dagger, pierced the silent air of the Sussex residence with a force that left even seasoned palace staff stunned into paralysis. According to one former aide, it wasn't just verbal. In a moment that now echoes like a tremor behind closed royal walls, Meghan Markle allegedly slapped Prince Harry right in front of staff. A confrontation so raw, so unfiltered, that those who witnessed it have reportedly struggled to forget what they saw. Before we continue, please like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell for updates. This isn't just tabloid gossip or online hearsay. This is a moment that, if confirmed, could reshape the public perception of the most controversial royal couple of the modern age. What began as a fairy tale, an American actress marrying a British prince, now appears to be a crumbling facade, hiding beneath it a palace drama more chaotic than anything Netflix could script. This video doesn't aim to sensationalize a private dispute for shock value. No, what you're about to witness is a deep dive, painstakingly pieced together from insider accounts, behavioral patterns, past interviews, and years of media dissection. It's not about taking sides. It's about looking at the truth that may have been shielded from public view by PR teams, non-disclosure agreements, and royal protocol. It's about asking the hard questions no one else dares to. Because if Meghan Markle really did slap Prince Harry, her husband, the son of a king, the man she publicly claims to love and protect, then this isn't just a story about two celebrities. It's a story about power, identity, and psychological warfare inside one of the most famous families on earth. And it may just confirm every quiet suspicion that something behind the Sussex curtain has been deeply wrong for a very long time. To understand how it came to this, we have to pull back the royal curtain, not gently, but with force. We need to go back, far back, into the shifting sands of their marriage, their exodus from the UK, the rise of their media empire, and the implosion of their personal world behind the gilded gates of Montecito. But first, let's look at the night in question. According to one high-level palace source, the argument began with something deceptively small, a missed call. Harry had attempted to reach out to his brother, Prince William, during a particularly tense period after the release of his memoir Spare. Meghan, reportedly furious that Harry was still seeking validation from a family that rejected them, confronted him with a storm of accusations. The argument escalated rapidly. Words exchanged in clipped tones, then in raised voices, until it exploded into what witnesses called a flashpoint of pure rage. That's when the words came out. "You're just a spare." Delivered with icy contempt, they weren't just words of anger. They were the ultimate emotional atom bomb. A callback to the title of Harry's own memoir. A brutal reminder of the nickname that's haunted him since childhood. For Meghan to use that phrase, allegedly in front of staff, was to twist the very wound Harry had finally opened up to the world. And then came the alleged slap. Not a dramatic Hollywood backhand, but something much colder, calculated, even. A palm to the cheek. Sharp. Quick. Intended not to injure, but to dominate. It wasn't about pain. It was about power. And those who saw it? They froze. No one moved. No one spoke. Because in that moment, the royal illusion shattered. The aide who leaked this didn't speak out for fame or revenge. They reportedly broke their silence after months of internal conflict, disturbed by what they had seen and unable to reconcile the public image of the couple with the private reality behind palace walls. "It wasn't the slap that haunted me," they reportedly said. "It was how normal it seemed. Like it wasn't the first time." This video will not only reconstruct what happened that night, it will explore why it happened, what built up to that moment, how Harry's identity has slowly eroded under the strain of loyalty, isolation, and trauma, how Meghan's ambition and survival instinct may have transformed her from a supportive partner into an emotionally volatile figure who knows exactly where to strike when she wants to inflict the most damage. But we're not stopping there. We'll bring you testimony from former staff who describe a pattern of volatile behavior inside the Sussex household. We'll examine leaked messages, anonymous whistleblowers, and insider tips that suggest this moment was not an isolated breakdown, but part of a larger behavioral pattern. We'll explore whether Harry, the man once seen as the cheeky, spirited Prince of Britain, is now trapped in a gilded cage of his own making, emotionally manipulated, professionally isolated, and personally conflicted. We'll dig into what "you're just a spare" truly means, not just as a personal insult, but as a metaphor for Harry's place in the world. A man who was born second and spent a lifetime fighting for significance. A man who once thought love might rescue him from his role as the backup, only to now face the possibility that the woman he loved sees him no differently than the family he tried to escape. And yes, we'll also address the royal reaction. Did King Charles know? Did Prince William confront him about it? What does Buckingham Palace do when its most unpredictable family members implode privately but remain globally visible? As this story unravels, you'll start to see how tightly the palace machine tries to hold the seams together, even as insiders say everything inside is falling apart. You'll begin to question the glitzy PR campaigns, the curated Netflix appearances, and the $100 million brand built on truth and healing. Because if this slap happened, and the sources are credible, it throws everything into question. How can a couple committed to love and progress, to mental health awareness, and emotional safety justify explosive, demeaning behavior behind closed doors? How can someone who tells the world she was bullied by the firm allegedly unleash the same cruelty on her own husband? And most of all, how much longer can this royal illusion survive? So don't blink, don't scroll, don't tune out. Because this isn't just a headline. It's a revelation. It's the unraveling of a royal marriage. And what lies beneath may be far darker than any of us imagined. This is the story of how power can corrode love, how pain can repeat itself, and how a single sentence, "You're just a spare," might just be the most dangerous phrase uttered in the modern history of the royal family. It began like a fairy tale. Cameras flashed, crowds roared, and millions watched as Meghan Markle, the American actress turned Duchess-in-waiting, walked down the aisle in St. George's Chapel to marry Prince Harry, one of the most beloved figures in the modern British royal family. The public believed they were witnessing history, not just a royal wedding, but the beginning of a new era. A biracial American woman marrying into the House of Windsor was seen as a symbol of progress, a breath of modernity, and a potential salve on centuries-old royal rigidity. From that day, the couple became a force of global fascination. News outlets dubbed them the royal rock stars. Their photographs graced magazine covers across continents. Their body language at public engagements, touching hands, gazing into each other's eyes, whispering in crowds, spoke of genuine intimacy. For a while, it appeared they had everything: youth, charisma, international appeal, and each other. But behind the veneer of harmony and romance, subtle cracks had already begun to form. While the world focused on their fashion choices and overseas tours, something far more fragile was developing in private. The fairy tale narrative was heavily controlled, curated to perfection by seasoned PR professionals. It was not a lie per se, but it was far from the full truth. It was a stage set, beautiful but hollow. Even before the wedding, insiders whisper that tension began mounting between Meghan and the palace staff. Her American directness clashed with the British royal institution's stiff upper-lip traditions. According to those close to the couple's inner circle, Meghan arrived in the palace with a sense of urgency. She wanted to modernize everything: protocols, schedules, even the way royal events were photographed. She questioned why things were done a certain way and demanded explanations, often challenging rules that had gone unquestioned for generations. To outsiders, that sounded like the mark of a strong woman stepping into a conservative system. But within the palace walls, it became something else entirely. Staff members began to describe her as demanding, sharp-tongued, and unyielding. Some even claimed she created a culture of fear. Aides reportedly cried during meetings. Schedules were torn apart and rebuilt daily. Staff turnover skyrocketed in a household that had once been defined by loyalty and stability. Harry, once the charming, approachable royal who laughed with the press and shared beers with his security team, began to change. He grew more protective, more distant. The friendly banter with journalists turned into icy glares. Invitations to his inner circle dried up. Former army comrades and school friends found themselves ghosted. Slowly, his world began to shrink, until only one voice seemed to hold sway: Meghan's. Those who had watched Harry grow up saw the shift clearly. They weren't seeing the same man anymore. He was still physically present at engagements, still shook hands and smiled, but the light behind the smile had dimmed. Some of his old friends whispered that he seemed controlled, muted, even lost. The once vibrant royal who'd been known as the fun-loving, rebellious prince now seemed perpetually on edge. The illusion of bliss was kept alive by masterful storytelling. The couple's Instagram page painted a picture of loving parents and global changemakers. Their interviews were filled with soft lighting, heartfelt declarations, and anecdotes designed to pull at emotional strings. They spoke of compassion, mental health, and charity, painting themselves as victims of a cold system that never understood them. And for many, that was enough. Their fan base, particularly in the United States, swallowed the story whole. Meghan was the brave outsider, and Harry, her loyal husband, who had finally broken free from a toxic institution to start anew. But for palace insiders, staffers, and those close to the firm, the story being told to the public was a work of fiction. The real dynamics were far less romantic. Staff who once worked closely with the couple privately described a household defined by anxiety and tension. Schedules were changed at a whim. Emails came at odd hours, sometimes with multiple exclamation marks or messages written in all caps. Meghan's expectations, they said, were not unreasonable in themselves, but her delivery was. She was described as hyper-focused on image and obsessed with controlling every detail of their public narrative. One aide recalled being asked to find a specific type of throw pillow for a last-minute Netflix interview shoot within 30 minutes. When she failed to meet the deadline, she claimed she was scolded in front of others and told she was making Meghan look sloppy. Another spoke of a rehearsal for a charity appearance where Meghan allegedly demanded 5 retakes of a walking shot because her posture didn't look powerful enough. Harry, according to multiple sources, did not intervene. He stood silently beside her, nodding, agreeing, occasionally offering a calming word, but never correcting her or pushing back. Over time, many in the household came to see Harry not as a leader, but as someone being led. His presence at meetings was symbolic, not operational. When tensions became public, such as reports of disagreements with Kate Middleton over flower girl dresses or staff suddenly resigning mid-tour, the palace scrambled to downplay the controversies. Official statements were sparse. The royal family's long-standing motto, never complain, never explain, was tested to the limit. But behind closed doors, damage control was constant. Even other royals began to distance themselves. William and Kate allegedly grew wary of including the Sussexes in family planning. Queen Elizabeth, known for her deep sense of tradition and discipline, was reportedly deeply concerned about the growing rift. And Prince Charles, while more emotionally sympathetic to Harry, began to realize the situation was spiraling out of control. Still, the illusion held. Public appearances continued. Speeches were made. Birthdays celebrated. When Archie was born, the couple released photos on their terms. They chose which press were allowed to cover the event and which angles were shown. The press, once Harry's frenemies, had now become his declared enemies. And so, the illusion of royal bliss endured, but only just. But the palace is not a place where illusions can last forever. Inside its ancient walls, gossip flows like wine, and silence is a myth. Word of Meghan's outbursts, of Harry's withdrawal, of staff walking on eggshells, all began to seep through the cracks. Whispers turned into quiet confirmations. And soon, those whispers became explosive revelations, culminating in what one staffer would describe as the final straw. A confrontation so intense, so shocking, that even those used to the emotional strain of royal life could no longer ignore it. A slap. A scream. A phrase that no one in the palace expected to hear, let alone witness. You're just a spare. It was the shattering of a carefully maintained image. A moment that made the illusion of royal bliss impossible to sustain. From that point on, nothing would be the same again. This chapter is not about judging a marriage or casting blame. It's about pulling back the royal curtain and showing what lay behind the polished optics. It's about the people, some loyal, some silenced, who bore witness to a relationship far more complex and turbulent than the world had been led to believe. And now, as more voices begin to break their silence, a new story emerges. Not of a fairy tale, but of a slow, painful descent into conflict, control, and emotional volatility. A story that may only just be beginning. For months, the story remained buried beneath layers of confidentiality agreements, loyalty oaths, and whispered warnings. Those who had seen the confrontation, those who had been in the room or within earshot, said nothing publicly. It was a moment frozen in memory but sealed behind royal protocol, protected by fear of consequences. Until now. The first crack came in the form of an off-the-record comment to a journalist known for covering royal affairs with discretion. At the time, it was simply described as a concerning incident between the Duke and Duchess of Sussex witnessed by staff. The comment went largely unnoticed, buried in a longer article about declining morale among palace aides. But for a few within media and royal circles, it was a red flag. Something had happened. Over the following months, more pieces began to surface. A former security detail quietly left their post. A personal assistant who had worked closely with Meghan took a sabbatical and never returned. A long-serving royal scheduler requested reassignment. All had one thing in common. They had access to the Sussex inner household, and they were leaving. The silence finally broke when one former aide, no longer bound by direct employment and protected by anonymity, decided to speak. Not to tabloids, not for money, but to an independent investigative journalist who had spent years building trust within palace networks. This aide, who we'll refer to simply as Olivia, became the first to publicly describe what happened during what she called the most emotionally violent episode I've ever witnessed in my professional life. Olivia began working with the Sussex household shortly after the couple's move to Frogmore Cottage. With a background in logistics and household operations, she had worked previously under Prince Charles and was known for her professionalism, discretion, and resilience in high-pressure environments. She'd seen tempers flare before. Royals, like celebrities and CEOs, lived in a world where stress was constant and the stakes were high. But nothing prepared her for what she would witness one late afternoon inside the Sussex residence. According to Olivia, the day had been tense from the outset. The couple had been in meetings regarding their planned transition out of full-time royal duties, what would later become globally known as Megxit. There had been heated phone calls with advisors. A press release was being drafted, and both Harry and Meghan were frustrated with the constraints the palace was attempting to impose on the wording. Meghan, Olivia says, was pacing, clearly agitated that they weren't being allowed to control their own narrative. Then, out of nowhere, Harry mentioned reaching out to William again. That was the trigger. Olivia says Meghan's expression changed instantly. She turned to Harry, and within seconds the room transformed. Her voice rose, initially just sharp, but quickly growing louder, angrier. Why would you call him? After everything they've done to us, she allegedly demanded. Harry responded quietly, something about still wanting to mend things. But Meghan wasn't having it. She called him naive, Olivia recalls. She said, "You're still trying to be their lapdog." And then she said it, loud enough that everyone in the house could hear. "You're just a spare. That's all you've ever been to them, and now you're just a spare to me too." The word spare echoed like a detonation. The air thickened. And then, Olivia says, pausing, she slapped him. The slap wasn't brutal, she clarifies. It wasn't a movie-style hit. It was short, sudden, and controlled, almost more symbolic than violent. But it stunned everyone. Harry didn't speak. He didn't raise his voice or leave the room. He simply sat back down, looked at the floor, and said nothing. What Olivia says disturbed her most was not the act itself, but the absence of reaction from Harry. He didn't protest. He didn't flinch. He just shut down. Like it had happened before, she recounts. In the hours after the incident, Olivia says she considered reporting it through formal channels. But she quickly learned the palace had no interest in exposing the Sussex's internal issues, especially not during the sensitive period of their planned departure. Everything was about optics. The couple were to be managed, not confronted. The goal, she was told by a senior aide, was to keep them happy until they're out. But Olivia couldn't forget what she had seen. The slap, the words, the reaction. That moment played in my head for weeks, she says. It made me question everything. All the public declarations of love, the documentaries, the hand-holding. If someone treats their spouse like that in front of others, what happens when no one is watching? Others, too, began to reach out quietly. Staff members who had witnessed Meghan's alleged volatility, usually in the form of verbal outbursts, micromanagement, or public humiliation of aides. Some said Meghan's mood could change in an instant. She'd go from warm and gracious to cold and hostile, depending on whether she thought something reflected well on her, said one former team member who assisted on the couple's Africa tour. What made Olivia's account so credible was her reluctance to go public. She declined multiple requests for interviews, refused payment offers, and would only allow her account to be published on condition of anonymity and in long-form format, not tabloid soundbites. Her goal, she insisted, was not to destroy anyone's character, but to protect the truth from being buried under spin and denial. Once Olivia's account began circulating in journalistic circles, it sparked renewed interest in the Sussex household from a new type of reporter, those who didn't rely on royal access, and thus couldn't be frozen out. Suddenly, timelines were re-examined. Staff departures were cross-referenced. Leaked emails were re-evaluated. And a chilling pattern began to emerge. Meghan's defenders have argued that any such behavior must be contextualized, that she was under enormous stress, targeted by a racist press, and unsupported by the institution she married into. They claim her frustration was justified, and that former staff were exaggerating events out of resentment or bitterness. But Olivia disputes this. There's no amount of stress that justifies slapping someone, she says. Especially not your partner. Especially not in front of staff. Especially not when the entire world sees you as a model of compassion and integrity. Her account sparked a chain reaction. Within weeks, more staff began speaking privately. Not all had witnessed the incident, but many shared experiences of similar emotional volatility. Yelling over minor details. Scolding assistants for being 5 minutes late. Demanding last-minute overhauls of event logistics because Meghan didn't like the color of the flower arrangements or the camera angles. One aide recalled Meghan losing her temper over the lighting during a video call with a major charity partner. She said it made her look average, the aide said. She insisted we rearrange the entire setup just to find the perfect glow. Meanwhile, the charity representatives were left waiting. Another staffer described being reduced to tears after being reprimanded over an incorrectly placed coffee mug during an informal interview shoot. She said I was sabotaging her image. Over a mug, the aide said. But none of those incidents carried the emotional gravity of Olivia's testimony. That single moment, those 5 seconds of confrontation, now sit at the center of a narrative that challenges everything the public believes about Harry and Meghan. And for Olivia, the weight of that moment remains heavy. I still remember his face, she says. Not shocked. Not angry. Just resigned. Like someone who'd stopped believing he deserved better. This chapter in the saga of the Sussexes is not about villainizing Meghan or victimizing Harry. It is about accountability. About understanding how image can diverge so far from reality. About how emotional harm can live quietly behind glamorous photographs and curated love stories. For years, the Sussexes have portrayed themselves as survivors of a cruel system, fighters for justice and personal freedom. But Olivia's account, and the subsequent confirmations from other staff, suggest that they may also have been creators of their own dysfunction, not merely reacting to trauma, but inflicting it. The palace has not commented on these reports, nor has Buckingham Palace launched any formal investigation into the Sussexes' household conduct since their departure. But for those who were there, who saw, heard, and endured, it is clear that the truth cannot remain hidden forever. And as the testimonies mount, a question grows louder. If the palace was willing to protect Harry and Meghan from scandal, who was protecting Harry now? It was early evening in the Sussex household, just before sunset, when everything changed. The air was still heavy from a humid California day. Staff had finished their routine duties, quietly tapering off into the background. Inside the Montecito estate, the atmosphere was deceptively calm until the tone shifted. Something unseen at first, but instantly felt. Those present later described it as the kind of silence that comes before a storm. From the hallway, muffled voices grew louder. At first, it was Meghan's voice, sharp and clipped, echoing through the halls with increasing urgency. Harry's was lower, slower, his tone harder to catch. But whatever was being said, it was not going well. Moments later, a door slammed. Not forcefully, but loud enough to freeze the few remaining staff members in their places. The kind of slam that announced control. A punctuation mark in a sentence of rising tension. At the center of this storm was a disagreement. One that had apparently been brewing for weeks, if not months. According to an insider familiar with the timeline, the fight was sparked by a conversation between Harry and his royal advisors regarding his future involvement in Commonwealth-related initiatives. Harry had expressed interest in participating in an upcoming event hosted by the Prince's Trust, a move that would have placed him on a professional path back toward the monarchy, however subtly. Meghan, reportedly, saw it as a betrayal. She confronted Harry immediately, not just about the event, but what it symbolized. To her, this was yet another sign that Harry couldn't fully sever himself from the institution she had fought so hard to escape. In her eyes, this was regression, a dangerous reopening of the wounds they had promised each other would remain closed. The confrontation began in the private study, one of the quieter rooms on the estate, where Harry often retreated to read or work alone. Meghan followed him in, holding her phone in one hand, reportedly having just come off a heated call with their joint publicist. The staff who later recounted what happened said her voice was already elevated when she entered the room. "You said you were done with them," she reportedly shouted. "You looked me in the eyes and said we were building something new together. Why are you crawling back to them now?" Harry's reply was calm at first. He tried to explain his reasoning. The cause was bigger than the institution, he said. It was about continuing meaningful work, especially for young people in the Commonwealth. But Meghan was unmoved. "You're not going back for them," she said. "You're going back because you still need their approval. You want to be their good little spare again." The word hit hard. Spare. A word Harry had publicly reclaimed in the title of his own memoir. A word that symbolized a lifetime of feeling second best, unwanted, surplus. He had worn it like a badge of rebellion. But coming from Meghan, it didn't feel like empowerment. It felt like humiliation. Harry, according to witnesses, looked stunned. Not because the word was unfamiliar, but because of who was using it and how. The argument escalated. Meghan accused him of undermining their shared brand, of jeopardizing everything they had built in America. The book deals, the Netflix contract, the podcast series, all, she claimed, were now at risk because of his need to be needed by a system that had discarded them. She accused him of weakness, of betrayal, of failing to stand beside her. Harry, in return, defended his intentions. He reminded her that he had sacrificed everything for her, his country, his titles, his relationship with his family, that he had endured ridicule, headlines, and accusations just to keep their family together. But Meghan wasn't listening. Or if she was, she wasn't buying it. Then came the moment that staff remember most vividly. "You're just a spare," Meghan reportedly screamed, her voice carrying down the hallway like a shot. There was a pause, long enough for the silence to feel like a vacuum. Then, a sound. Sharp. Sudden. The slap. It wasn't loud, but it was distinct. Not a struggle. Not a fight. Just one single motion. What happened next was even more unsettling than the act itself. Harry said nothing. His reaction, according to a staff member who saw the aftermath, was one of complete stillness. He didn't walk away. He didn't shout. He didn't even raise his hand in response. He just stood there, face slightly turned, eyes lowered, breathing shallow. For the next several minutes, the couple remained behind the closed doors of the study. No other sounds emerged. Eventually, Meghan walked out, briskly passing by two staff members in the corridor without making eye contact. Her expression was unreadable, neither remorseful nor triumphant. Just composed. Controlled. Harry didn't emerge for nearly an hour. When he did, his face showed no visible mark. But the emotional damage, according to those present, was impossible to ignore. One staff member described his expression as vacant, like he was watching something unfold from the outside. Another said he looked defeated, but familiar with the feeling, like it wasn't the first time. The household went into silent crisis mode. Staff, deeply disturbed, discussed what they had seen among themselves, but didn't escalate the issue formally. There was no HR report, no legal complaint, and no whisper of it ever reached Buckingham Palace, at least, not officially. Why? The answer is as political as it is psychological. At that point in time, the Sussexes were still in the midst of building their American empire. Any scandal, especially one involving domestic conflict, would have derailed their efforts entirely. The Netflix documentary had just premiered. Archetypes had recently launched. The public image of a strong, united couple fighting for justice was the linchpin of their brand. Any hint of internal fracture could have sent the entire structure crumbling. So, the moment was buried. Until now. One aide later described the environment in the house following the confrontation as fragile, like everyone was walking across glass. Interactions were quieter. Instructions were more cautious. Meghan appeared even more controlling than usual, reportedly vetting emails personally and obsessing over optics in the days that followed. Harry, meanwhile, became increasingly withdrawn. He would disappear into his study for hours. Conversations with staff were limited to logistical necessities. Some staff considered leaving. Others already had. But those who remained did so out of a complex mix of loyalty, caution, and resignation. One long-time household assistant said it best. It wasn't just that something terrible had happened. It was that we all knew nothing would come of it. That we were supposed to pretend it didn't happen and continue smiling for the cameras. For many, that night marked a turning point. It was no longer possible to reconcile the public narrative with the private truth. The interviews about love, healing, and mutual respect now felt like scripts rather than reflections of reality. The carefully edited footage of the couple cuddling their children, giving inspirational speeches, and posing for Vogue now played like scenes from a film, well-crafted, but entirely detached from the truths unfolding just off camera. The incident also cast a new light on earlier patterns of behavior that staff had dismissed or downplayed. The outbursts, the mood swings, the late-night emails, the walking on eggshells, all now made sense within a larger framework. What had once seemed like stress responses or personality quirks now looked like symptoms of a much deeper dysfunction. And through it all, one question haunted those who had witnessed the moment. Was Harry okay? The concern wasn't for his physical safety. The slap had not caused visible harm. It was the emotional impact that troubled them. The look in his eyes, the silence, the sense that he had internalized something he could no longer resist, deny, or escape. Because for all the headlines about him leaving the firm, walking away from royal life, or building something new, none of it seemed to bring him peace. And for those who saw him that night, it was clear the cost of escape had been far higher than anyone could have imagined. This chapter is not just about a slap. It is about a rupture, a moment in which everything that had been carefully constructed, every interview, every public smile, every claim of unity, suddenly collapsed under the weight of unspoken truth. And now, that truth is beginning to surface. The morning after the alleged confrontation between Meghan Markle and Prince Harry, the atmosphere within the Sussex household was markedly subdued. Staff moved with more caution than usual, avoiding unnecessary interaction and keeping their voices low. It wasn't just a reaction to the previous night's events, it was self-preservation. Everyone who had witnessed or heard what transpired understood one thing with crystal clarity. They had seen something they weren't supposed to see, something that could never officially be acknowledged. But while the Sussex estate may have been sealed off from the public, it was not immune to internal currents of gossip and concern. Within hours, whispers about the incident began to travel, first among house staff, then to outer layers of the royal household system. By noon, the rumor had reached ears in Kensington Palace and Clarence House. Not through official reports or breach of protocol, but through the oldest royal network in existence, informal, confidential, off-the-record conversations between trusted staff. One palace advisor later remarked that the walls talk faster than the press. And in this case, they did. Within 24 hours, senior aides to Prince William and King Charles were quietly made aware that something explosive had taken place within the Sussex residence. At first, the details were vague. A domestic argument, raised voices, a humiliating insult hurled at Harry. But as more information came forward from individuals close to the scene, the pieces began to form a more disturbing picture. Not only had Meghan allegedly screamed, "You're just a spare," at Harry, but she had reportedly struck him, and it had happened in front of staff. The response within the royal household was one of private alarm and institutional panic. Not because of the scandal itself, royal families, like all families, are no strangers to conflict, but because of the potential fallout if such an incident ever became public. With the Sussexes still operating under the banner of royalty, albeit in a semi-detached role, any story of abuse, verbal or physical, would have reverberated across the monarchy and its global image. What made this especially complicated was the palace's precarious relationship with the Sussexes. Since their exit in early 2020, Harry and Meghan had remained tethered to the monarchy in an awkward half-in, half-out status. They still used their Duke and Duchess titles. They still made public statements with royal implications. And, most of all, they still carried enormous press value, both as insiders and critics of the firm. As such, any direct intervention by the palace could easily be spun as retaliation, revenge, or institutional suppression. This created a dilemma: to act or not to act. According to a source close to King Charles's private office, the king was informed in general terms but not provided the full details. The message was clear: there had been a concerning episode in Montecito involving his son and Meghan. But the specifics, including the slap, were reportedly omitted at that stage. This wasn't an accident. It was intentional damage control. The goal was to alert the monarch without provoking a scandal or a reaction that could escalate tensions further. Privately, Charles was said to be deeply distressed. His relationship with Harry had been strained since the Oprah interview, further strained by Spare, and now teetering on the edge of total collapse. But Charles, despite his heartbreak, remained bound by the invisible chains of monarchy, duty, discretion, and legacy. He could not afford a public split with his youngest son, nor could he afford another scandal centered around a royal marriage descending into chaos. Instead of addressing the incident head-on, the palace implemented what sources called the containment protocol. Communications were carefully monitored. External staff interactions were limited. and those who had knowledge of the event were reminded firmly of their confidentiality agreements. Any leak would be considered a breach of the Official Secrets Act or grounds for legal action, depending on the context. But even containment had its limits. At Kensington Palace, where Prince William resided, the reaction was more emotional than strategic. William had long been frustrated with Harry's choices, but his protective instincts had never fully vanished. When informed by one of his senior aides that Harry had been subjected to a degrading and possibly violent exchange, William's initial reaction was reportedly explosive. He was furious, one insider said, not just at Meghan, but at the system that had allowed this to go unchecked. He felt like Harry had become isolated, manipulated, and emasculated. William, who had already drawn boundaries around his relationship with Harry, considered reaching out personally, but senior advisors warned against it. Any direct intervention could be perceived as intrusive, and worse, could trigger another public feud if Meghan or Harry framed it as an attack. The last thing the monarchy needed was another televised exposé, especially one that could weaponize an emotional confrontation as part of a broader narrative of oppression. So William, like his father, remained publicly silent. But the silence, in both cases, did not reflect inaction behind the scenes. The royal security apparatus began updating its internal assessments. Concerns were raised about Harry's emotional well-being. Not for his physical safety, there were no reports suggesting ongoing abuse, but for the long-term mental toll such an environment could inflict. Quiet inquiries were made. A close friend of Harry's, not officially affiliated with the palace but respected by both brothers, was encouraged to check in under the pretense of casual communication. The feedback was worrying. Harry, the friend said, seemed withdrawn and defensive. He denied any major issues but admitted he was under a lot of pressure. When asked directly about the fight, Harry became visibly tense and said only, "Things get heated sometimes." It was a deflection, but a telling one. Inside the palace, that statement was interpreted as a tacit acknowledgement. Meanwhile, Meghan remained publicly unaffected. Her social media-facing projects continued without interruption. Her appearances on panels, virtual events, and lifestyle initiatives reflected a woman fully in control of her image and message. The press, still divided between critics and supporters, didn't pick up on the storm beneath the surface. And that was the brilliance and danger of the Sussex media machine. It was designed to disarm, to redirect attention, and to saturate the news cycle with soft-focused stories and positive spin. One day, Meghan was promoting women's empowerment in corporate boardrooms. The next, she was endorsing organic jams or partnering with mental health organizations. All the while, no one asked what was happening behind her own front door. But inside the palace, the fallout continued. Morale among royal aides, particularly those who had worked with the Sussexes before their departure, hit a new low. Many felt vindicated. They had raised red flags years earlier, complaints about mistreatment, emotional outbursts, unreasonable demands. At the time, those complaints had been buried, dismissed, or reframed as racism or resistance to change. Now, those same former aides watched the latest revelations unfold and asked themselves a painful question. Had they been right all along? The palace's refusal to publicly address the incident became its own controversy. To insiders, it appeared the institution was once again prioritizing image over individuals, protecting the reputation of the monarchy at the expense of accountability. To others, it was a necessary act of discretion in a media environment where nuance is often lost. But either way, the cost was growing. The longer the palace remained silent, the more control Harry and Meghan had over the narrative. If the incident ever leaked, the monarchy would be accused of covering up domestic strife. If they acted too forcefully, they risked triggering another media war with the couple, and this time, with legal consequences. The choice they faced was both simple and impossible. Do they protect the individual, or do they protect the crown? For now, the crown won. But those who saw what unfolded behind the palace gates understood the deeper truth that beneath the golden exterior of tradition and stability, the monarchy was being tested from within. Not by scandal in the tabloids, but by the collapse of trust, loyalty, and silence. And while no formal statement would ever be released about what happened in Montecito that night, the memory of it lingered like a shadow in every room of the royal household. The image of Prince Harry that most of the world grew up with was one of energy, rebellion, and warmth. He was the charismatic younger son, the boy who walked behind his mother's coffin with a stoic face and hollow eyes, then re-emerged as the soldier prince, bold, brash, and beloved. But that boy, that young man, seems almost unrecognizable now to those who once knew him intimately. In his place stands a man who appears more guarded, more controlled, and, according to multiple insiders, more alone than ever. The confrontation with Meghan, as explosive as it was, did not occur in a vacuum. It was the culmination of years of subtle, accumulating pressures, psychological stressors that slowly eroded the independence of a man who once stood at the center of public affection. To understand what happened in that room, and to understand why Harry said nothing in response, one must first examine the journey that led him there. From the beginning, Harry was defined by contrast. Where William was the heir, Harry was the spare. Where William was composed and dutiful, Harry was emotional and impulsive. That contrast served him well in his younger years. It made him relatable. But it also marked him, deeply and invisibly, as second. Not just in succession, but in significance. Behind palace walls, Harry struggled with a unique identity crisis. He was royal enough to be scrutinized, but not royal enough to shape the monarchy's direction. Every decision, every mistake, was dissected without the protective shield that often surrounded his older brother. When he partied, it was reckless. When he rebelled, it was ungrateful. When he laughed too loudly or dated the wrong girl, it was tabloid fodder. Yet through it all, there was a core of resilience, fortified by his military service and his work with veterans, children, and mental health charities. It was during one of his more vulnerable periods, recovering from multiple breakups and coping with unresolved trauma over his mother's death, that Meghan Markle entered his life. She appeared, to those around him, like a stabilizing force. Intelligent, worldly, and assertive, she seemed to fill the void of uncertainty Harry often struggled to articulate. In Meghan, Harry saw not just a partner but a new beginning. Someone who understood pain, who had battled her own demons in the unforgiving world of entertainment and racial politics. At first, their relationship appeared balanced. But over time, it became clear that Meghan's strength and Harry's emotional dependence were forming a different kind of dynamic, one that leaned heavily in her favor. Friends who once had open access to Harry found themselves shut out. Phone calls went unanswered. Texts were ignored. Invitations to dinners or hunting weekends were declined or never responded to. The army mates he once called brothers were no longer part of his daily life. Even senior staff who had been with him since his teenage years were gradually pushed aside. Publicly, this shift was interpreted as Meghan protecting Harry from toxicity. She was framed as the liberator, shielding him from a hostile press, a dysfunctional family, and an archaic institution. But privately, those closest to Harry began to see a different picture, one of increasing isolation, one of subtle control masked as concern. It was like watching someone disappear in slow motion, said a former aide who worked in the royal communications team. He wasn't being dragged into anything. He was stepping into it willingly, but you could see he was surrendering more and more of himself with every step. One of the earliest signs of this shift came just before the couple's wedding. Harry, known for his easy rapport with his staff, began snapping at them, short, impatient, occasionally hostile. When asked about the sudden change, a colleague replied, "He's not himself anymore. Everything has to go through her now." Meghan, for her part, took command of most decisions. Wardrobe, media interviews, even travel logistics. Nothing was signed off without her input. It wasn't a partnership, it was a consolidation. Some of this, naturally, could be attributed to the intense pressures both faced. Meghan was navigating a royal institution unprepared for her American directness and unwilling to bend its traditions. Harry was caught between loyalty to his family and loyalty to the woman he loved. The world was watching. Every move was scrutinized. But under that pressure, something more profound was happening. Harry was slowly, silently becoming dependent. This dependency wasn't physical. It wasn't economic. It was emotional. Meghan became his center of gravity, the one person he could trust, the one voice that mattered. And when that voice began to critique, manipulate, or demand, Harry had no counterbalance. No one else had the same access, the same influence, the same control over his reality. Over time, this imbalance deepened. Friends who attempted interventions were met with stonewalls. "He thinks we're jealous," said one longtime friend who was reportedly cut off after expressing concern. "He thinks we want to sabotage his happiness." Family members fared no better. William's attempts to discuss Meghan early in the relationship allegedly resulted in a cold rupture that has yet to fully heal. Charles, always more reserved, tried a softer approach, but Harry interpreted even gentle guidance as judgment. In Montecito, The physical distance from the royal family became symbolic of something deeper, emotional exile. Here, Harry and Meghan could build their kingdom without interference. But that kingdom, for all its privacy and luxury, became a kind of fortress, one that kept others out and kept Harry in. Those who worked in the Sussex home described a filtering process around Harry. Emails and calls were screened. Messages from old friends were rarely passed along. Meghan handled most external communications. Harry, according to some staff, appeared less and less involved in everyday decisions. He didn't need to be told what to do, one aide explained. He just didn't do anything without checking with her first. This kind of dynamic is not uncommon in relationships where emotional dependency has quietly taken root. It's not about overt abuse or aggression. It's about control through necessity. Meghan became the gatekeeper to Harry's world, and Harry, in turn, found safety in the simplicity of that arrangement. He no longer had to navigate conflicting loyalties, demanding schedules, or institutional politics. He just had to align with her. But emotional safety purchased through dependency is fragile. When cracks appear, when the person you rely on begins to wound rather than protect, the fallout is devastating. And that is what made the slap so significant. It wasn't the act itself. It was what it revealed. That in the very space Harry had believed to be his sanctuary, he was not sovereign. That the person he had entrusted with his emotional healing was capable of using his deepest insecurity, his identity, as the spare, as a weapon. That the voice that once told him, "You matter," could just as easily say, "You're nothing." And perhaps most devastating of all, that when it happened, he had no one to turn to, no one to call, no circle of old friends, no confidant within the palace, no therapist nearby, just silence and stillness. Because this is what psychological pressure does, it isolates. It doesn't come with visible bruises or scandalous outbursts. It comes with slow erosion, with a voice that rewrites your story until you forget the original, with a life that narrows, conversation by conversation, until you can no longer hear anything but the person whose approval you crave most. There are those who still argue that Harry is free, that he made his choices, that he finally escaped a family and institution that never truly loved him. But freedom is more than the absence of a title. It is the ability to act independently, to think clearly, to feel without fear. And in Harry's current state, many believe he is far from free. What the slap revealed was not just a moment of anger. It revealed a system of dependence that has left one of the world's most visible men profoundly alone. And while Meghan continues to command stages, headlines, and brand deals, Harry remains somewhere in the background, quiet, tense, and, according to some who know him, drifting. The real question now is not whether Harry will speak. It's whether he even can. Because when your world has been built around a single person, even the smallest rupture feels like the end of everything. The insult itself was short, brutal in its simplicity. "You're just a spare," delivered in a heated moment. The phrase may have sounded like a standard put down to anyone unfamiliar with royal culture. But to Prince Harry, it was more than a jab. It was the deepest, rawest cut possible. It was an unmasking of everything he had carried since birth, everything he had fought to overcome, and everything he feared was still true. In the House of Windsor, identity is destiny. From the moment a royal child is born, their purpose is implicitly defined by their place in the line of succession. Prince William, the firstborn, was always the heir. His life was mapped out with ceremonial precision. The future king, the public face of stability, the symbol of continuity. Harry, born 2 years later, was the spare, the backup, the contingency plan. Historically, the heir and the spare is a phrase entrenched in royal vocabulary, especially in monarchies that must preserve bloodlines at all costs. The heir ensures the future of the crown. The spare is there in case the heir falls. In function, the role may seem practical. In emotional terms, it is crushing. As a boy, Harry struggled to make sense of his role. While William was prepped for kingship, attending briefings, being coached in diplomacy, and sitting in on meetings with courtiers, Harry was mostly sidelined. Not out of cruelty, but out of structure. The system had no real use for him beyond symbolic representation and photo ops. He was told, implicitly and explicitly, to smile, stay in line, and not cause trouble. But Harry did cause trouble. He acted out, perhaps as a subconscious protest against his predetermined role. He wore a Nazi costume at a party and was globally condemned. He clashed with photographers. He got into drunken brawls. Each time, the headlines screamed, "Despair in Crisis" or "Royal Wild Child Gone Rogue." And each time, the palace issued carefully crafted statements, disapproving but vague, protective but cold. In public, Harry was painted as the cheeky one, the relatable one, the fun one. The truth behind that image, however, was darker. Being despair didn't just mean being second, it meant being disposable. Every failure became proof that the crown had chosen wisely in William. Every misstep reinforced the perception that Harry was unfit for leadership, even though no one had ever prepared him to lead. The death of Princess Diana only intensified this dynamic. While William internalized the weight of royal duty as a teenager, Harry internalized the loss of maternal protection. Diana had seen him, not as the spare, but as a whole person. She had fought, often against the institution, to shield him from that label. In her death, he lost the one person who had loved him without condition or hierarchy. Years later, when Harry wrote his memoir and titled it Spare, it was both an act of defiance and a cry for recognition. He took the word that had defined him for decades and turned it into a banner. In reclaiming it, he tried to own the pain. To finally tell the world, in his own words, what it meant to grow up as an afterthought in a family obsessed with image and legacy. So when Meghan, the woman he had given everything up for, allegedly hurled the phrase, "You're just a spare," at him during a fight, the effect was not temporary. It was devastating. It wasn't just an insult, it was confirmation of his deepest fear, that even in this new world he had built for himself, he still wasn't enough. That moment broke through every defense he had constructed. The years of therapy, the countless speeches about trauma and healing, the public appearances that portrayed a man reborn. None of it could stop the echo of that one word in that one context. It wasn't the institution speaking this time. It wasn't the press. It wasn't his father. It was his wife. The person who was supposed to understand him better than anyone else had used the very label he had spent a lifetime trying to escape. And she had used it not in private, but in front of staff. That mattered. Because for Harry, public humiliation had always been a recurring trauma. The boy whose naked photos were leaked from a Las Vegas hotel. The prince whose every misstep made tabloid headlines. The man who had been told, over and over again, that he was a disappointment. To hear Meghan echo the same sentiment, even once, shattered something essential. Psychologists who study family dynamics often speak of the power of internalized labels. When a child is told repeatedly that they are the troublemaker, the lazy one, or the spare, it becomes a part of their identity. Even as adults, they may unconsciously seek out relationships that reinforce that label until it becomes impossible to distinguish between what was assigned and what is real. This is the lens through which Harry's reaction must be understood. He did not shout. He did not cry. He did not walk away. He froze. Because he knew the label. He had lived it. And now, hearing it from the person he trusted most, there was nowhere left to retreat. Some might ask why Meghan would use such a phrase. Was it intentional? Was it said in the heat of the moment? Was it a calculated act of emotional manipulation, or simply an emotional outburst? The answer may lie somewhere in between. Relationships under pressure often expose hidden resentments. And Meghan, navigating her own frustrations, may have reached for the sharpest weapon available in that moment. But intent matters less than impact. The phrase pierced a wound that was never fully healed. In doing so, it did more than hurt, it dismantled. It unraveled the fragile sense of self that Harry had built outside of the royal family. It reminded him that no matter how far he ran, how loudly he spoke, or how many interviews he gave, he was still, in someone's eyes, a backup plan. And that has consequences. After the confrontation, those around Harry described a change in demeanor. He became more reserved, more passive. His public appearances lacked the energy he once brought to causes he cared about. His eyes, once alive with mischief and conviction, now seemed dulled by something he couldn't name. Because how do you name the feeling of becoming invisible again? That phrase, just a spare, is not unique to Harry, though. Many second children, middle siblings, or family members who feel sidelined carry a version of it. It's a narrative that whispers, "You're not the favorite. You're not the important one. You're the backup."